And we are recording. You may begin.
My name is Perry Fuller. I have been a pastor in the Christian Church, Churches of Christ, for about 44 years, during which time I have served as youth pastor, associate pastor, and senior pastor. I am presently the associate pastor at Playa Christian Church in Playa Vista. My ministries have always included pastoral counseling. I have a Bachelor of Sacred Literature, a Master of Science in Psychology, and I am now, in my old age, pursuing a doctoral degree in psychology. Thank you so much for having me today. We are going to discuss the topic of grief. Let me describe a college kid who was away at college when his dad entered the hospital with prostate cancer. He made it back home to see his dad, and the two had a good visit. But knowing that he had 300 miles to drive back to school by the next day, he said, "See you later, Dad." His dad hesitated with a weak, "Yes, see you later." His response was weak, not because his strength was waning, but because he knew that he would not see his son again. But I ignored it, pretending that I had not noticed. I justified leaving because I had to get back to school. So I went back to school, and 4 days later, my dad died. We had two funeral services, one in St. Louis and another one back home in the small town of Nacogdoches, Texas, where my dad grew up. I did not cry at either service. I had to be strong for my little brother, especially my big sister, and for my mom. I was the rock who comforted everyone else. About 2 months later, I was back home watching TV when a commercial came on, and all of a sudden, I started crying hard. For a long time, I couldn't stop crying. No one else was around. It was just me sobbing. I learned a few things about grief that day and in the years to follow, and I would like to share some of those observations with you today. Grief is indeed the neglected emotion. Grief is difficult to talk about because it is so closely related to death. Most people are uncomfortable talking about death. We use phrases like passed away, transitioned, or the person has left us. These phrases take some of the sting out of the idea of death to make it less harsh. So grief by association with death gets neglected. As a result, grief can sneak up on you unawares because you may have avoided the topic for a long time. Let's define grief. Grief is deep sorrow, especially caused by someone's death or significant loss. It is sadness, emotional pain, mourning, or bereavement. Someone described grief by saying, grief is the inward expression of loss. Mourning is the outward expression of grief. Grief can be further described this way. Grieving is like having broken ribs. On the outside, you look fine, but with every breath, it hurts. There are two types of grief that I have observed. One is anticipated grief. Anticipated grief is sadness related to what you know is coming. Membership in ACTS means that you may be grieving even while caring for your loved one who is still with you. You are doing your best to enjoy your loved one in the present, but oddly, you are sad. This is anticipated grief. It is a misunderstood kind of grief. Your loved one is still with you. Why are you sad? What's wrong with you? Well, there's nothing wrong with you. You are simply anticipating loss. And when your loved one passes, This kind of grief can make it seem to others as if you are unfeeling or didn't really care about your loved one because it looks like you're too callous to grieve. What others don't know is that you have been grieving already for a long time, every day for a long time. That is anticipated grief. Realized grief is grief connected to actual loss. But realized grief can hit you even while your loved one is still with you because you may be mourning the loss of what was, what used to be. It used to be that your loved one was the person caring for everyone else. Now they are being cared for. That's a loss that can be the object of grief. It used to be that your loved one was strong. Now they are weak. He or she used to laugh. Now all humor is gone. Maybe an occasional glimpse of laughter. Uh, but for the most part, it's gone. It used to be that your loved one was witty and sharp and never missed a beat. Now it is difficult carrying on a conversation of any substance. Those are changes that can prompt grief. Because remember, we define grief as sadness over significant loss. Realized grief can be experienced even while your loved one is with you because you're seeing significant loss in so many ways. It is sadness related to loss already experienced or unwelcome change. Realized grief is sadness about what you did not want to happen. There are myths about grief. First, men don't cry. That's the myth that I gave into when my dad died. I thought it was in the unwritten rule book of how to be a man, but I have looked closely at that rule book and it's not there. Men do cry. In fact, men, tears are restorative. And men, we rob ourselves of the cleansing nature of tears by forcing ourselves not to cry, which leads to the second myth about grief, which is grieving equals weakness. This myth applies to men and women. The encouragement you may hear to be strong should not mean don't grieve. Grieving does not equal weakness. That is a myth. If you're familiar with the narrative in the Gospel of John of Jesus dealing with the death of his friend Lazarus, you will notice that when Jesus saw the sister of Lazarus, Mary, crying, Jesus too was overwhelmed with emotion and he cried. And it was a hard cry to the point that those who were there said, "My, how Jesus loved his friend Lazarus." So here is the Son of God who was about to perform a miracle that would leave everyone speechless and talking about it for a long time, crying. Jesus was crying a deep cry. This tells me that grieving does not equal weakness. It is a part of the human experience, and the one who was a model of how to move through life cried for his friend. How can it equal weakness? Well, it doesn't. The third myth is that you must move on. This myth is tricky because when people say this, they fail to acknowledge that moving on is not possible or even desirable because the person you lost is still with you. The person who died contributed to who you are today. They are an ongoing part of you, and you cannot leave them behind. Your task is not to move on, but to move forward with life, with the realization that your loved one continues to influence you and be a part of you with their memories and moments and realizations that will continue to gently move you. Moving forward with grief is a better way to approach loss. Moving on is good, but only if it means that you are looking toward moving forward. It's a subtle difference, but an important difference. Let's talk about the anatomy of grief. There are 5 stages of grief presented by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that you may be familiar with. Denial is rejecting the news in order to stagger its impact. It is adopting a preferable reality, at least for now. Um, this could not be, and you're rejecting it. for now. Anger. Anger is characterized by blaming something or someone. Often it is God that we blame when we're angry. Anger is sometimes accompanied by a sense of aloneness, extreme aloneness. Bargaining. Bargaining is a kind of negotiation, a willingness to change in order to change reality. But bargaining is useless. And when we realize that there is no negotiating the loss of someone that is already gone, then we are likely to move into depression. Depression is a sense of overwhelm and hopelessness. It represents the emptiness that we feel from the loss. And then finally, there's acceptance. Your emotions stabilize, you re-engage with reality and with people, and the new reality becomes clear and acceptable. There is no correct way to grieve as long as you grieve. Just like the way you laugh is very individual to you, so is the way you grieve. Your grief may not look like the next person's grief. So there is no, you're not doing it right. Having said that, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has presented what she observed to be the 5 basic stages of grief. So what if you arrive at acceptance and you have skipped a couple of steps, or you experience them out of order? Is that okay? Yes, that's okay. And just when you thought you had it figured out, there is a 7-stage model of grief, which is also presented by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her co-author David Kessler. They add shock, which comes before denial. Shock is the initial sense of paralysis, paralysis of decisions, paralysis of movement. The world just stands still. And the other stage that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross adds is testing. Testing happens before acceptance. And testing is experimenting with ways to better manage and cope with loss. You will figure that out. Testing is the phase in which that happens. An important aspect of grief is movement. Movement through these various stages is what we want. Please be aware that remaining in one phase can be unhealthy. We're told that about 10% of people grieving become stalled in one of these phases of grief. So that the way grief is experienced by some, unfortunately, looks like this. If you find yourself stuck in one phase, know that you are denying yourself the full range of emotion and grieving. Although there may not be one right way to grieve, I would suggest that movement is a good way to judge how well you're doing with grief. If you are aware of being stuck, it would be good to talk to someone, a therapist, a good friend, a pastor, or a fellow member of ACTS. Movement is good when it comes to grief. Let me share an example. King David of the Old Testament was grieving for his child who was sick. His child was still alive, but David was a man in mourning. He had not shaven, he had removed his royal garb, and was likely wearing the traditional mourner's clothes of sackcloth. King David was literally on the floor. He was in intense prayer on behalf of his child. He was grieving. After 7 days, David noticed his servants on the other side of the room whispering, and he knew what that meant. The child had died. The servants were afraid of giving him the news, not certain how he would react, but King David did that which seemed odd to them. He got up off the floor, cleaned himself up, dressed, and requested something to eat. It seemed as if his grief were backwards, but that is how he did it. He also took this time of loss to draw close to the Lord. He writes in Psalm 38, "Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation." Grief is indeed complicated. There are more than one way to move through grief. Movement, though, is the key. Grief is best experienced with someone near. This observation about grief is not about you, it's about you helping someone else who has lost their loved one. It is good if you can be close by in case the grieving person needs someone. It is good if you can be a friend to someone in grief, not in an obtrusive, disrespecting boundaries kind of way, but in a I'm here if you need me kind of way. Grief shared is good grief. Grief shared is about relationships. It is what you are engaged in when you involve yourself in acts. So ask someone how they're doing and be prepared for whatever answer they give. Don't accept their first answer as the real answer necessarily. I'm fine doesn't always mean I'm fine. Sometimes it does. But the task of a good friend is to find that right balance between not asking and asking too much. Remain available. Don't disappear too soon. We have the tendency to be right there with someone at first when they lose their loved one, and then we go away. Everyone is gone before the grieving person has finished the last casserole dish. So be a long term friend. Acts, once again, is perfect for the experience of grief occurring with someone near. Your regular meetings are an excellent way to navigate the waters of grief together. And you can stay in touch in between meetings. I'm pretty sure you can. Did you know that the tall sequoia tree has very shallow roots? The reason the tree grows so tall and survives high winds is because the roots of each tree is intertwined with the roots of the tree next to it, and the tree next to it, and the tree next to it, and so on. Like the root system of the sequoia tree, you can weather the storms of life by supporting one another. Grief is best experienced with someone near. So, this is a good way to walk through grief. Celebrate small and large moments. If your loved one is still with you, celebrate that. Have lots of mom, remember when moments, even if you're the only one talking. If your loved one is gone, celebrate those memories with friends, with siblings, other family members. Have many remember when dad did this or that conversations. Talking about grief, as we're doing right now, does not mean that you are a traitor to your loved one. Rather, it makes you prepared. And grief and depression are not the same. Clinically, they are different. There is overlap, but they are different. There are two attitudes I've noticed that you can hold on to that will help grief: gratitude and hope. Develop gratitude. Thankfulness is a good companion to grief. It can help you as you move through the various stages. And nurture hope. Hope can mitigate grief. If you are a person of faith, hope can be a companion emotion that will smooth the harsh edges of grief. It's the hope that Jesus spoke about to the sisters of Lazarus, Martha and Mary. He assured these grieving sisters that belief in him meant life for their loved one. Hope for the future can help the present moment. Grief is a matter of perspective. Let me conclude with this. You may have seen this wall that I'm referring to. There's a wall, the side of a building on La Brea Boulevard, north of San Vicente, that has been used over the months as a mural. I don't know who the building belongs to or even if the person painting messages on it was authorized, but one day this caught my attention. On a white background were the large letters painted in black that read, "Life is beautiful." At the base of the wall on the sidewalk were the belongings of a homeless person, quite a contrast to the message above, so I took a picture. A few weeks later, I drove by and the letters were still up, except someone had painted over the letters and the word beautiful, the B, E, T, and I, and these letters had been erased, leaving the letters A, U, and FUL, awful. The wall now read, "Life is awful," once again with the belongings of a homeless person still on the sidewalk below. This demonstrated to me that one's view of life changes with perspective. Life can be either beautiful or awful, depending on how you look at it. And grief is like that. Grief can be awful. It too, though, can be debilitating. Grief is not a welcome emotion, but there is a certain beauty to grief if we will allow it. Grief can foster healing. Grief can be restorative and good. The role grief plays in your life is according to the perspective you choose. Bernie Siegel said, "One cannot get through life without pain. What we can do is choose how to use the pain that life presents to us." So thank you for letting me share with you today these observations about grief. May God bless you.
Thank you, Pastor Perry.
You're welcome. Thank you for letting me re-record this.
Uh-oh, hold on.